Oh man, has Constellation thrown a fun little monkey wrench into how everything is slowly unfolding by giving the spotlight to Paul. That's a different Paul. Anyway, we're jumping into everything, the small changes and effects Paul has had on Joe and vice versa, potential theories, and what the heck that ending means for the final 2 episodes. This might be my favorite episode of this series so far because things depart from Joe having the spotlight and rather focus things on Paul, but the holy wackadoo twist is that this follows the alive version of Paul that's in the red universe, something that we had pointed out in our 2-universe blue and red image. But the alive Paul is actually from the blue universe originally and had switched just like Joe had switched from the red universe to the blue universe. I mentioned this in my episode 1 through 3 breakdown, but this series feels like it's taken pieces from the Cloverfield paradox, and now I'd say it's taken influences from 2013's Coherence in the way that characters are switching universes and are essentially chalked up as crazy people because elements in their new world are not aligning with what they remember. Also, just like a shout out to Coherence, a great film, I highly recommend. Reeling it back, confusing I know, but pretty much everything in this episode is showcasing events playing out in the red universe, of which we have only seen glimpses and theorized what was actually happening in this universe. So again, to be clear, almost all of this episode takes place in the red universe, with blue universe Paul experiencing them, meaning that Joe is the one who perished in the ISS instant, and I'm not gonna lie, is gnarly as hell when her face smashes and her eye is essentially sucked through the hole in the glass. Now quick theory, the camera pulling out from the ISS, I think it's supposed to be Joe's eye floating into the unknown. Anyway, Paul basically goes through everything Joe had to do as well, staying back aboard the ISS, fixing the escape pod with the batteries, and so forth. However, we learn Joe was the one who saved Paul and essentially herself by unlatching the bolts on the door. Now, I find it a little odd that Paul straight up leaves Joe's carcass up in the ISS, but again, he's mentally dealing with a lot at this point. Another thing I noticed is that the timing on Paul's clocks versus Joe's when certain recordings bleed over. For example, when Paul tells Joe to stop breathing, his clock is sometime after 4:02:02, while Joe's is at 4:42:42 when she hears his voice saying the same thing. I know previously it was mentioned that space-time dilation to Earth equates to a difference of roughly 0.007 seconds for like every 6 months you're aboard the ISS, but I'm curious if the show is playing with this and quantum entanglement, and this is the prime reason Joe claims to have lost time in episode 2. Also, Paul's clock doesn't count seconds in this quick scene. It could be an editing error, but I think this means more than solely to like overlook it. Like this might actually mean something. Before we continue, I want to touch on some of the parallels that bleed over between these 2 different universes and help to explain some of the weird things that have happened. For example, the cosmonaut floating into space right after the universe switch could be because of the timing issue that we just mentioned. Magnus has similar but different interactions with the child crafting the little bat, Erica consoling Alice on the plane instead of Magnus consoling Wendy. Joe has the vision of her approaching the wardrobe with Alice's beads on the door, while Alice is in the wardrobe and sees Joe's flashlight coming closer. Joe and Paul hear each other's audio over the on-flight recording system a couple of different times.
Hurry up. This is the 3rd. Kind of need to hurry up. This is the 3rd. Kind of need to hurry up.
You gotta stop breathing. Stop breathing, Joe. You stay in destiny. Stop breathing. Stop breathing, Joe. You stay in destiny.
Joe and Paul touching hands shows them a quick glimpse of the 2 different universes. Joe appears to be the one who saved, again, both Paul and herself by unlatching the bolts on the door. Paul witnesses Joe at the cemetery, while Joe witnesses Paul at the cemetery with his cane. At Joe's funeral, not only does Alice see herself and Joe, but Paul witnesses this too. Paul calls his wife Frida instead of Erica, whereas Joe called her Erica, where her name was actually Frida. At the small breakfast or dinner scene, Paul looks at a picture of Joe, while episode 3, I believe it is the opposite of Joe looking at a picture of Paul. Alice looks up to the window to see Henry just appear, whereas Henry originally witnessed 2 different Alices, which leads to Alice stomping on her stuffed rabbit, and then Alice viewing the same act of aggression. And lastly, Alice hearing a piano despite them not owning one, and this is actually Joe in the different universe playing the piano. I'm sure there are a couple of other parallels that I missed, but yeah, this is cool and interesting to see how these 2 different universes are similar but different. I think the biggest thing is that the Cal experiment was abandoned in the Red universe, whereas it's the reason all of this started in the Blue universe. Anyway, Paul is maybe the smartest person in this entire series at this point because he clearly knows something is wrong. He knows he is right, which is funny because Joe is just like, I guess I do have a blue car instead of a red one, da-da-da-da-da, doo-doo-doo. So Paul starts digging because at this point there is no Cal device in the Red universe. He's basically deemed cuckoo Cachoo and knows Henry Caldera probably knows what the heck actually happened because of the Apollo 18 conspiracy and him potentially have gone through something very similar. Because in the quick YouTube video Paul watches, there is a quick camera shift showing that the passengers are safe and then suddenly showing that they are not. So upon arriving at Henry's, or rather the Bud's place, because this is the Red universe that we are in, we can see all of the newspaper clippings about the Apollo 18 tragedy all over the walls, so obviously Bud is living a regretful life, very much an alcoholic as well. Bud is just as confused as everyone else Paul has talked to, rightfully so, because he is essentially a changeling to this universe, symbolized by the changeling picture right before this scene takes place. But then again, there is a small percentage of Bud knowing that Paul and he may be suffering from the same thing, which they claim is high-altitude psychosis. Now, this psychotic disorder is in fact a real concept, most commonly seen in mountain climbers because of their exposure to high elevations, and this is an offshoot of altitude sickness. This is most likely why NASA and ESA prescribed certain astronauts with the B vitamins, aka the antipsychotics. They truly believe that this is what the astronauts are suffering from. However, Paul and Henry, or I guess Bud, know that it's actually a side effect of the Cal experiment. It is interesting, though, because the ongoing narrative of sweeping things under the rug by space programs is very apparent. Heck, even the YouTube video Alice watches is a prime example of this, being the Nettling catastrophe, which was a launch pad accident that occurred on October 24th, 1960, and they just kept things pretty much under wraps for nearly 30 years. Unfortunately, the scene between the two ends with what appears to be Bud shooting Paul. Yeah, I think he really does shoot Paul, but something is going to happen where Bud comes out of his alcoholic ramblings, realizing what he has done to Paul and what Paul is actually suffering from is the same fate as him, or the Cal device shifts the Henry and Bud duo, which was teased in episode 5 with the mirror scenes and him, tinkling in his nice khakis, and Henry will now be back to his original Red universe. If either of the two happen, I'm betting on a team up between the two, an attempt to get back to the Blue universe, where apparently their lives are thought to be much better. It's a massive stretch, so let me know your theories or thoughts on this Bud and Paul situation in the comments. The ending with Alice and Magnus up at the cabin is probably the most confusing part of this episode, because we've seen Joe and Alice in the Blue universe from episode 1 make it to this same cabin, but there wasn't anyone there, the lights weren't on, heck, the paintings are even different, with episode 1 showcasing the wounded angel in the Blue universe, and episode 3 showcasing the changeling picture in the Red universe. Now, the reason this Alice is able to see Joe and the other Alice is definitely because of the Cal device's presence. Last week and a few times in this episode, exposure or closeness to the Cal seems to be bringing the universal entanglement closer to one another, and both or one or the other can peer into the other universe. witnessed by Paul, Henry, and Alice a handful of times. Again, I don't know the specific rules of how this officially works in the Constellation world, but Alice peering out the window is her watching Joe and herself arrive at the cabin in episode 1, which is essentially the liminal state, meaning that's been teased by Alice's teacher claiming 10 is a liminal age, I believe in episode 2. Anyway, liminal means something that is an intermediate state, phase, or condition, much like we're seeing these two bleed over into one another. So my guess is that the red universe Alice is the one peering out of the window. She will then trek out into the snow looking for Joe, but she is on the other side of the lake. Then Joe in episode 1 hearing someone yell out, "Mama!" is the same Alice now out in the snow looking for Joe. Joe then follows this voice out into the other cabin, finding the Alice hiding in the cabinet wearing the fur hat. Also, I apologize if I keep repeating myself week to week, but just keeping things clear and straight between these two universes is a task all in of itself. Oh, and Alice's beads here. Please someone let me know what these are supposed to represent, because I'm like Mark Anthony right now. That's everything in episode 6, and again, honestly, my favorite episode of this series so far because of how everything is playing out, little things being results of other little things, and just the internal struggle of emotion Paul is dealing with, essentially knowing and living in a world that is foreign to him. Part of me wishes that the showrunners would have gotten real crazy with the different universes, like sci-fi the heck out of it, but the somewhat grounded nature of quantum theories and mechanics at play would have lost, they would have had less of an impact. What did you think of episode 6? What theories do you have for these final 2 episodes? Drop everything in the comments below. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and be sure to subscribe to JBuck Studios. It really helps the channel and motivates me to stay up to date, cranking out these breakdowns for everyone. If you haven't, please check out all of my other social media accounts. Everything is in the description down below. I just got back from South by Southwest, so I'll have a big video on everything I watched down there next week. Stay tuned, you're the bestest. And yeah, you know what? Peace out, dudes.